The last time we spoke properly, Mike, was when I was presenting the Unbelievable show, and we were doing kind of a retrospective on the very sad case of Arzim, Ravi Zacharias. That's kind of been my area, apologetics, for many years, and so I was obviously everyone was struck by how huge this was when it came out posthumously that he had been kind of abusive, sexually abusive, and spiritually abusive in various ways. And that led to essentially the implosion of what was at the time the world's largest apologetics ministry. But that's just one, sadly, among many stories over the last 5 or 6 years that have come to light. There are probably many more names we could mention. I think there are I think some people had kind of got used to the kind of televangelist scandal, the Jim Bakker type thing, and they were like, you could kind of roll your eyes. But when it happened to people that within the evangelical world had incredible amounts of respect, and people really had built, a lot of their faith journey around, I think it struck really, really particularly hard at that point. So I remember just being, really winded by all of the revelations that came out around Ravi Zacharias. There was a friend of mine, a Canadian pastor, who has sadly been caught up in a scandal in the last few years. And again, he was the last person I expected that to happen to here in the UK just in the last year. And you may not be so familiar with this, Mike, but a very significant church leader, Mike Pilavachi, has now been lots of things coming out about ways he's acted towards interns and young men in his ministry. And again, you could hardly think of a more influential person who has probably had more of a arguably positive impact on more people's faith in the UK than Mike Pilavachi. So these are not your kind of, we can just roll our eyes at this televangelist. These are significant people. So I guess without particularly commenting on any of those specific cases, I guess the question is, how on earth do you navigate this when these are people that people have absolutely invested their life and their faith kind of have flowed out of those ministries in so many ways?
Yeah, man, it's a great question. I think this is where, if you have to sort of pull back a bit and say, what do we make of the institutions that back these people up and have ultimately failed, to hold them accountable, have failed to protect the people in their midst. What's the sort of what's the post-mortem on the institutions themselves, and what do we learn from that? And then what does transparency look like on the other side of it? And I got to be honest, I'm not encouraged by what I see in terms of the self-reflection around all of this. RCIM is a perfect example of that. The institution, really protected Ravi. He was the exception to every rule. Mm-hmm. As the story came out more and more, you just saw ways that he was the exception to every rule, because they were so dependent upon him. When I was reporting the Mars Hill story, I remember listening to conversations, various conversations, some that were on the record, some that were off the record, some that were recordings of these meetings between elders from all the way back in 2013, 2014. And just listening to these things and thinking about how often there was this sense of deference to Mark, because the sense was, if we don't let sort of like this, let's not forget that we wouldn't have any of this if Mark weren't here. Right. And there's a sense in which that's true, but there's also a sense in which the smart question to follow that up with is, well, wait a minute, if that's true, then what are we actually protecting here? Right. If this is the house that Mark built and it's supposed to be the church, have we created something that's not quite the church anymore? What is this institution now that we're so carefully preserving? And so I say that to say that I think, and again, I don't mean to beat this drum with Billy Graham, but Billy Graham did build this institution around him that was intended to, to prevent certain very common, very basic human flaws that he was aware of, and that he took very seriously, and in ways that I don't think a lot of our institutions do. We, you've seen this surge of non-denominational church over the years, and you've also seen this push from the church growth movement to kind of strip the denominations from to kind of strip the denominations of their authority, so that the churches can move faster, so that charismatic leaders can move up the chain more quickly and have more power. And I think this is a great moment to go, hey, what did that get us? And again, the last thing I'd say is it just comes back to that question of ends. Like, how are we measuring our success? If success is simply about numbers, if success is simply about the growth of the movement, and the sense of excitement and energy that comes from charisma and everything else, then I think we've really got to stop and kind of call that into question as well, and say, well, what are we doing? Like, how are we preparing people for their encounters with death? How are we building? How are we preparing the institutions for our own deaths? What's going to be here in 30, 40, 50 years when we're all returned to ashes?
Yeah.
I don't think that question's being asked hardly at all.